You know how it is you want to get a solid handle on the really important stuff shaping our world, but, well, time is precious, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're looking for that shortcut to being well informed without getting bogged down in endless reports?
And that's exactly what we do here.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive. We take the complex stuff and pull out the crucial insights for you.
And today, we're diving deep into a really pivotal shift. It's happening in an industry that's, well, fundamental to modern life,
Yeah.
the global chemical industry.
Right.
We're going to explore its transition away from fossil fuels, towards more sustainable approaches.
And our main guide for this journey is a really comprehensive research paper. From fossil to green chemicals, sustainable pathways, and new carbon feedstocks for the global chemical industry. It was published in Energy and Environmental Science back in 2023.
Yep, and we'll be calling it this study as we go.
So why is this specific topic so critical?
Well, it's profoundly important. As this study makes really clear, the chemical industry underpins so much of what we use every single day.
Like plastics, fertilizers.
Exactly. The plastics in our phones, our cars, the fertilizers for food production, countless materials.
Mhm.
But it's also a significant source of global CO2 emissions.
How significant are we talking?
Currently around 3% globally, according to the study.
Okay, 3%. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this study points this out. If we don't change course, the chemical industry could actually become the single largest consumer of fossil fuels globally.
Yeah, let that sink in. The largest.
Wow.
And, unlike some sectors that can just sort of plug directly into renewable electricity.
Or like power generation itself.
Exactly. This study highlights a unique challenge for the chemical industry. It fundamentally needs carbon-based feedstocks. It needs carbon atoms.
So you can't just like eliminate carbon entirely.
Not for the products themselves, no. So the core question this study tackles is, where will that essential carbon come from in a sustainable future?
Okay, so let's unpack this. What does this study tell us about the current state of play? What's the baseline we're starting from?
Well, this study paints a picture of really substantial and accelerating growth. The demand for chemical products, especially plastics, has been expanding incredibly quickly,
Faster than the economy overall.
even outpacing global GDP growth, yeah. To give you an idea, the study points out that resins and fibers used for plastics saw an average annual growth of 8.4% between 1950 and 2015.
8.4% annually for 65 years.
Yeah, that really gives you a sense of the immense scale and the momentum here.
That's just a staggering rate. But this study also reveals something that might seem a bit counterintuitive at first glance.
Right, exactly. Despite being this massive consumer of oil and gas for energy in its processes.
You'd think it would be the number one emitter.
You would. But this study notes it was only the third largest industrial CO2 emitter in 2019, about 920 million tons from primary production.
Why is that?
It's because a large chunk of the fossil fuels it uses aren't actually burned for energy. Instead, they serve as crucial raw materials feedstocks.
Ah, okay.
And the carbon atoms from those fuels literally become part of the final products, like the plastic itself.
So it's not just smokestack emissions, it's the carbon locked into the stuff we make.
Precisely. Embedded carbon.
Okay. Then this study introduces us to the sort of the fundamental building blocks, right? The 7 key ones.
That's right. This study identifies these as the foundation chemicals, the ones from which a vast array of other products are made. You've got ammonia, methanol, ethylene, propylene.
The olefins.
Yep. And then benzene, toluene, and mixed xylenes. The last three are often grouped as BTX aromatics.
Okay.
And together, these 7 are often called high-value chemicals, or HVCs, just because they're so critical for so many downstream industries.
Right, HVCs. Got it. So let's dig into how these are traditionally made and, crucially, the emissions involved, according to this study. Maybe start with ammonia.
Sure. Ammonia, as this study explains, is primarily made using the Haber-Bosch process. We've known about that for a long time.
Right, standard process.
But currently, fossil methane natural gas is the dominant feedstock for the hydrogen needed. And this single process alone accounts for roughly 1.8% of global CO2 emissions.
Wow, just ammonia production.
Yeah, it's significant. The study mentions global production hit a massive 195 million tons back in 2018. And here's a key point from the study. The efficiency of converting that methane feedstock to ammonia using conventional methods is already nearly maxed out.
So we can't really squeeze much more out of the old process.
Pretty much. We're getting about as much ammonia out of the fossil methane as is chemically possible with these current methods. It really underscores why we need fundamentally different ways to make it.
Okay. And what does the study say about methanol production? Similar story.
Similar reliance on fossil fuels, yeah. Methanol production typically relies on syngas. That's a mixture of hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and CO2.
And where does the syngas come from?
Derived from fossil fuels, again, with fossil methane being the most common starting point, global production in 2018 was around 95 million tons. The study notes the CO2 emissions vary a bit depending on the exact method, but they're definitely a significant factor.
Okay. Then we have those high-value chemicals, ethylene, propylene, and the BTX aromatics. This study suggests their production is maybe a bit more complex.
It is, yeah. Ethylene and propylene, the olefins, are often produced together through a process called steam cracking.
Steam cracking sounds intense.
It kind of is. Think of it like taking long chains of hydrocarbons, usually from oil, like naphtha, and basically blasting them with high heat in the presence of steam.
To break them down.
Exactly, to break them into smaller, more useful molecules like ethylene and propylene. Naphtha is common, but the feedstock choice varies regionally, depending on what's available and cheapest.
Makes sense.
And the study highlights that the yields you get, how much ethylene versus propylene, can vary quite a bit depending on that feedstock and how you run the cracker. Production was huge in 2018. 160 million tons of ethylene, 107 million tons of propylene.
Huge numbers. And the BTX aromatics, benzene, toluene, xylene.
Those are primarily obtained through a different process called catalytic reforming, usually done with naphtha in oil refineries.
Okay. Now, this study also has to address plastic recycling, right? That seems like an obvious piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely crucial. And the study shows global collection rates have been improving. They went up from just 2% in 1990 to 15% in 2019.
15% globally.
Okay. And this is a big, but the research emphasizes there are huge regional differences.
Yeah.
For instance, in 2019, non-OECD Africa collected only about 8%, while OECD Europe collected over 25%.
Big disparity. And just collecting it isn't the end of the story, is it, according to the study?
No, not at all. Precisely. This study highlights that the actual rate of recycling that collected plastic globally is still pretty low.
So a lot of what's collected doesn't actually become new plastic.
Right. And furthermore, even with more collection, the growth in producing new plastics from recycled sources, what they call secondary production, as a share of the total plastic made, well, that growth has been quite slow. And the study also reminds us, that many plastics, especially packaging, have incredibly short lifespans.
Use it once, throw it away.
Pretty much. And that contributes to this massive projected increase in plastic waste generation by 2050 if we don't fundamentally shift our approach. Just think about the amount of plastic you encounter daily.
It's everywhere.
Packaging, clothes, cars. This study paints a really stark picture of where we're headed without big changes in how these materials are made and managed.
Okay, so given that whole picture, this study makes a clear argument for needing what it calls defossilization. Why that specific term? Why not just decarbonization?
That's a really key distinction this study makes, yeah. Because the chemical industry needs carbon as a basic raw material.
The building block.
Exactly, the fundamental Lego brick, as you said. Complete decarbonization, like, say, the electricity sector can aim for, isn't really fully possible for the chemical products themselves. So the industry needs to focus on defossilization.
Meaning getting the carbon from somewhere other than fossils?
Precisely. Shifting to sustainable, non-fossil sources of carbon for those essential feedstocks.
And this study highlights some particularly promising green carbon feedstocks to make that happen, right?
Yes, absolutely. Two really stand out in this study. Electricity-based methanol, or e-methanol, and biomass-based methanol, or biomethanol.
Methanol again.
Yeah, it emerges as the key player. These green methanols can be used directly, or they can serve as intermediate chemicals to produce those olefins and aromatics we talked about, ethylene, propylene, BTX, through processes like methanol to olefins, MTO, and methanol to aromatics, MTA.
Okay, MTO and MTA, we'll come back to those.
And the study also really underscores, again, the critical role of massively increasing plastic recycling to cut down the overall demand for these primary feedstocks, especially for the HVCs.
Right, use less new stuff in the first place.
Exactly. And the beauty of e-methanol, as this study points out, is that it acts like a crucial bridge. It doesn't just replace fossil methanol directly, it also opens up these new routes to the building blocks for plastics and other key chemicals. It could potentially decouple the whole sector from fossil carbon.
Okay, so let's explore some of these sustainable pathways this study examines more closely. First one, power to ammonia, or e-ammonia. How does that work?
Right, e-ammonia. As detailed in this study, it involves using renewable electricity, green electricity, to produce hydrogen.
Through electrolysis, splitting water.
Exactly, using electricity to split water molecules. This green hydrogen is then fed into the same conventional Haber-Bosch process we discussed earlier.
Ah, so you swap out the fossil-derived hydrogen for green hydrogen.
Precisely. You replace the hydrogen that currently comes from fossil fuels. Now, the study does note an interesting point. This process leads to increased water demand compared to traditional ammonia production because of that electrolysis step.
Water usage. That's definitely a factor to consider, especially in water-stressed regions.
It is, but the technology itself is actually quite mature. This study puts its technology readiness level, or TRL, at 8 to 9.
TRL 89, that means it's pretty much ready to go, right? Not just lab stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It indicates a high level of technological maturity, late stages of development, close to or already commercially available in some cases.
That's encouraging. What about e-methanol then? How does this study describe its production?
E-methanol production, as outlined here, involves taking captured CO2.
Captured CO2. From where?
It could be from the air, direct air capture, or DIA, or potentially from existing industrial emissions points. The study often assumes DIA in its main analysis, but point source is an option.
Okay, so you take captured CO2.
And you combine it with green hydrogen again, hydrogen made from renewable electricity via electrolysis, using a catalyst.
So CO2 plus green H2 methanol.
Basically, yes. It's a significant departure from conventional methanol production, which starts with that syngas from fossil fuels.
And water use.
Interestingly, the study points out that e-methanol production actually has a lower water requirement than the traditional method.
Oh, that's good. And the TRL, is it as ready as e-ammonia?
Slightly lower, according to the study around TRL7. But importantly, there are already existing and planned pilot and commercial plants demonstrating this.
Like where?
Well, the study mentions Carbon Recycling International. They have plants in Iceland and China. There's Power to Methanol Antwerp, Project Air in Sweden. So things are definitely happening. It's moving beyond the pilot stage.
Okay. Now, methanol itself isn't always the final chemical needed. This study talks about using it to make other key things, like olefins and aromatics. Let's talk about MTO, power to methanol to olefins.
Right, the MTO process. As described in this study, it takes that e-methanol, or potentially biomethanol, as the input.
The green methanol.
Yes, and it converts it into ethylene and propylene using a catalyst. What's particularly interesting here, and the study notes this, is that MTO technology is already commercially deployed.
Already running. Where?
Primarily in China, actually. Though currently they're mostly using methanol derived from coal, not e-methanol yet.
Ah, okay. So the process works, but the feedstock needs to switch.
Exactly. The process itself typically runs around 500 degrees Celsius, moderate pressure. And this study says it has good selectivity and mostly makes the ethylene and propylene you want. It also generates heat and water as byproducts.
Heat and water byproducts, could those be useful?
Yeah, the study notes they could potentially be recovered and utilized, which would improve the overall efficiency of the whole system.
Makes sense. And the other pathway mentioned in this study was MTA power to methanol to aromatics. How does that stack up against MTO?
Right, MTA. As this study details, this converts the e-methanol or biomethanol into those BTX aromatics, benzene, toluene, xylenes, using a specific type of catalyst, a zeolite catalyst.
Okay. Is it as developed as MTO?
No, this study indicates it's at an earlier stage. It puts the TRL at 7, same as e-methanol itself. The process runs at slightly lower temperatures than MPO, but higher pressures.
And the results? Does it work well?
Well, a key finding in the study is that the yield of the desired BTX aromatics is currently lower, with MTA only around 16% by weight.
Only 16%. What's the rest?
You get significant amounts of LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, and water as byproducts, plus substantial heat output. So less efficient for the target aromatics compared to MTO for olefins, at least based on current tech described in the study.
Okay, so MTO seems more mature than MTA for now. Now, this study also considers biomass as a feedstock, not just electricity-based routes. What are the key points there?
Biomass is definitely part of the picture in this study. It outlines biochemical routes, ways to use biological processes to produce ammonia, methanol, olefins, and aromatics from biomass.
But there are caveats.
Huge caveats. The study strongly emphasizes the critical need for sustainable sourcing. This is paramount,
When?
meaning only residues and waste should be considered. Things like lignocellulosic biomass, that's the woody, non-food parts of plants, agricultural leftovers, forestry residues.
Not competing with food crops.
Exactly. Avoiding competition with food production and also other energy sectors that might want that biomass is crucial. The study even mentions the estimated global limit on sustainable bioenergy to really drive home this constraint.
Is there an example of this working already?
Yeah, the study gives the example of bioethylene production in Brazil. They use sugarcane to produce bioethanol first, and then they dehydrate that ethanol to get ethylene. So that it's possible, but scale and sustainability of the biomass source are key.
Right. Now, interestingly, this study made a specific choice not to focus heavily on using fossil fuels, but capturing the carbon CCS. Why did they exclude that from their main sustainable pathways?
That was a conscious decision by the study authors, yeah. They excluded fossil feedstocks combined with carbon capture and storage, or CCS, from their primary analysis, mainly to avoid the potential for fossil lock-in.
Fossil lock-in, meaning sticking with fossil fuels for too long.
Exactly. The concern, as they articulate it in the study, is that relying heavily on CCS might just perpetuate the use of fossil fuels when the goal is to move away from them. Plus, there are questions about potential increased life cycle emissions when you account for the embedded carbon in the chemicals that eventually gets released.
So they really wanted to focus on pathways that break the fossil fuel link entirely.
That seems to be the core focus, yes. Identifying truly sustainable, non-fossil-based alternatives.
Okay. So, based on these potential pathways, this study then developed different scenarios to see how the future might play out. Can you give us an overview?
Sure. This study constructs several scenarios. There's a business-as-usual case, the BAU,
What happens if we just carry on as we are?
pretty much. Then they have net zero emissions scenarios, or NZE, aiming for net zero by different target years, 2040, 2050, and 2060.
Okay.
And within those NZE scenarios, they also explore variations depending on how much biomass feedstock is used, a high biomass version H and a low biomass version L.
High biomass versus low biomass. So more biomethanol or more e-methanol, basically.
That's a big part of it, yes. And importantly, these scenarios also factor in different assumptions about future plastic recycling rates and how much waste plastic gets incinerated.
And what's the projection under BAU? Just keep growing.
Essentially, yes. A key projection under the BAU scenario in this study is a significant continued increase in the total volume of primary chemicals produced globally. More demand, more production from fossil fuels.
But the NZD scenarios in the study must paint a different picture, especially with that recycling factored in.
Oh, absolutely. The study clearly demonstrates that hitting those significantly increased plastic recycling rates assumed in the NZD scenarios can substantially reduce the need for primary chemical production.
By how much?
They give percentage reductions by 2050. It makes a big dent, especially in the demand for ethylene and propylene, the main plastic precursors. Which means, consequently, the proportion of secondary plastics, the ones made from recycled material as a share of total plastic production, is projected to increase considerably in these NZE scenarios. More circularity.
And what does this study indicate about the shift in where the raw materials, the feedstocks, will come from in those greener futures?
A massive shift. In the NZD scenarios, the study clearly shows a transition away from today's overwhelming reliance on fossil fuels towards a much, much greater reliance on renewable electricity and sustainable biomass.
So less oil and gas, more solar panels, and farm waste, basically.
Oversimplifying a bit, but that's
Yeah.
the direction, yeah. The research quantifies the estimated electricity and biomass demands in 2050 for these scenarios. It really emphasizes the central and growing role of methanol, both e-methanol and biomethanol, as that key intermediate.
Interesting.
And it also highlights something new, a potentially valuable byproduct. All that excess heat generated from these power-to-chemicals processes, like MTO and MTA.
Right. You mentioned heat earlier. What could it be used for?
The study suggests it could find uses in various industrial processes nearby, or maybe even for district heating systems, turning waste heat into something useful.
The scale of the electricity demand in these net zero scenarios.
Yeah.
You said it was huge. How huge?
Immense is probably the right word. This study estimates a massive increase in electricity demand just for the chemical industry in 2050, compared to the total global electricity generation back in 2020.
Wow. The chemical industry alone needing more power than the whole world used recently.
Well, a significant fraction of it, certainly. It absolutely underscores the necessity of a rapid, large-scale expansion of renewable electricity generation capacity worldwide. A huge ramp-up is needed.
And what uses the most electricity within these chemical processes?
The highest demand, this study specifies, is for producing the E-hydrogen. That electrolysis step is very energy intensive. And the research also notes a necessary shift within the chemical plants themselves, moving process heating away from burning fossil fuels towards using electric heating methods instead, electrifying everything.
So what about the bottom line, the emissions trajectories? What does this study show there?
Well, as you'd probably guess, the BAU scenario shows emissions just keep climbing. No surprise there.
Right.
But in stark contrast, the NZE scenarios demonstrate a viable pathway to actually reaching net zero emissions for the chemical industry. It shows it can be done according to their models.
Any caveats? Does it happen smoothly?
The study does point out there might be a temporary increase or peak in emissions during the initial transition years.
Why?
It depends on how quickly the electricity grid itself gets cleaned up. If you're using lots of electricity for e-chemicals early on, but that electricity still comes partly from fossil fuels, your emissions might temporarily bump up before they fall.
Makes sense. Grid decarbonization is key.
Absolutely linked. And the research also indicates that the scenarios relying more heavily on biomass tend to have slightly lower emissions during that transition phase compared to the ones going all in on electricity right away.
Interesting nuance. Now, this study also mentioned potential shifts in where chemicals get made globally.
Yes, that's a fascinating part of the findings. The NZE scenarios in this study suggest a potential shift in the geographical center of gravity for chemical production,
Moving from where to where?
moving away from the currently dominant regions in the global north.
Europe, North America, parts of Asia?
Right, towards regions in the global south. This study specifically highlights potential growth in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia.
Why would it shift there?
It's primarily driven by where the demand growth is projected to be highest in these rapidly developing regions. And if they build new capacity, it makes sense to build the green capacity from the start.
So if demand grows fastest there, the new green factories get built there.
That's the logic suggested by the study's modeling, yes. And consequently, the study anticipates significant regional increases in demand for renewable electricity and e-hydrogen in those specific areas to support this potential new production capacity.
That implies massive investment needs in those regions for energy infrastructure, not just chemical plants.
Absolutely. The study touches on this indirectly. We're talking significant investment in renewables, hydrogen production, transport, the chemical facilities themselves. A major undertaking.
Okay. Let's talk economics. What did this study find regarding the costs of this massive transition?
Right, the costs. The study's analysis of annualized costs, sort of the total yearly expense, reveals some really interesting trends. It suggests that one of the net zero scenarios, the NZE 2050L.
That's the low biomass, high e-chemicals one.
Exactly. That scenario could potentially have lower overall annual costs by 2050 compared to just sticking with business as usual.
Lower cost for going green, how?
It's primarily driven by the projected continued fall in the cost of renewable electricity over the coming decades. If green electricity gets cheap enough, these e-chemical routes become very competitive.
What about the high biomass scenario? NZE 2050H.
That one, the study suggests, could actually see higher costs compared to BAU. That's mainly due to the potential costs and, importantly, the limited availability of truly sustainable biomass. Biomass might not be cheap or plentiful enough everywhere.
Interesting trade-off.
And the study also highlights a fundamental shift in the structure of the costs, moving away from costs being dominated by buying fossil fuels.
Like oil and gas prices.
Right. Towards costs being driven more by the upfront capital expenditure building the new plants, the electrolyzers, and the ongoing operational cost of electricity. It changes the whole financial equation.
And recycling helps with costs, too.
Definitely. The study points out that increased plastic recycling plays a significant role in reducing the overall system costs across all the NZE scenarios. Less primary production needed means lower overall expense.
And did the study look at the cost per ton of chemical produced?
Yes, they looked at the levelized cost of chemicals, or LCOC. The trends there, as presented in this study, largely mirror the annualized cost findings.
So e-chemicals potentially cheaper long-term if electricity costs fall?
Potentially, yes, with some regional variations showing up in the NZE 2050 scenarios. Interestingly, the study projects that North America could potentially achieve the lowest LCOC in 2050 under certain NZE scenarios, perhaps due to resource availability.
But there's a catch, right?
A crucial one. The study makes it very clear. without some form of carbon pricing or other economic mechanism that puts a cost on greenhouse gas emissions.
Like a carbon tax or cap and trade.
Exactly. Without that, the business as usual scenario, just burning fossil fuels, would likely remain the cheapest option purely from a company's perspective.
So policy is absolutely essential to make the green transition economically viable.
That's a major implication of the cost analysis in this study, yes. Policy levers are needed to bridge that gap, especially in the near term.
Okay, so stepping back, what are the really broad implications of this study? What does it suggest for the future trajectory of this massive global industry?
Well, I think this study provides a really valuable contribution. It lays out these scalable and potentially economically competitive, sustainable pathways for the global chemical industry.
Pathways that can be plugged into bigger energy models.
Exactly. That's important for planning. It also really highlights the potentially enormous future demand for e-hydrogen, just from this one sector.
How enormous.
The study suggests the chemical industry's demand for e-hydrogen could potentially exceed the needs of other major industrial sectors that are also looking to decarbonize. We're talking huge volumes.
Which means massive amounts of electrolyzer capacity needed.
Terawatts, potentially, by 2050, according to some estimates derived from the study. It also implies the need for terawatt-scale solar PV capacity just to power the chemical sector's needs and gigaton-scale CO2 capture facilities.
Gigatons of CO2 capture, either DIC or point source.
Right. Though the study notes that utilizing existing industrial CO2 streams could be a significant source, maybe lessening the immediate need for massive DIC buildout.
And the economic competitiveness.
It reiterates that the high electrification pathway, the low biomass one, looks economically promising if, and it's a big if, low-cost renewable electricity becomes widely available. That dependency is key.
Did the study suggest mixing strategies, like using both e-chemicals and biochemicals?
Yeah, it touches on the potential for a sort of coevolution, a synergistic approach, where maybe the limited sustainable biomass is strategically used for specific applications like producing biodegradable bioplastics, while e-chemicals do the heavy lifting for the bulk commodity chemicals.
Playing to the strengths of each pathway. Makes sense. Now, the authors of the study were upfront about limitations too, right? And areas needing more research.
Yes, they were. They pointed out limitations related to data availability and granularity. Getting detailed info for every region is tough. Also, assumptions made about how production might distribute regionally based just on feedstock availability.
So what needs more research?
They suggest future work could really dig into designing new supply chain configurations for this transformed industry. Also, looking at how different ways of calculating the cost of electricity, LCOE, might change the economic outlook.
What else?
Exploring the potential benefits of pushing plastic recycling rates even higher than assumed in their scenarios. And critically, figuring out how to best utilize or valorize the byproducts from these new processes, like the naphtha that might come from MTA, finding value in everything produced.
Okay, so let's try to summarize our deep dive into this study. From fossil to green chemicals, sustainable pathways, and new carbon feedstocks for the global chemical industry. What are the absolute key takeaways that you think stand out?
Right. Well, first, the chemical industry faces this huge critical transition away from fossil fuels. It's driven by environmental needs, and it's unavoidable, really.
Okay, the need is clear.
Second, this study highlights e-methanol and e-ammonia, powered by renewable electricity, as really promising core pathways to achieve this defossilization. Methanol, in particular, looks like a key hub chemical.
Got it. E-chemicals are central.
Third, realizing this vision isn't just about chemical tech. It absolutely requires a massive, rapid, global deployment of renewable energy infrastructure. Solar, wind, electrolyzers, CO2 capture. The scale is monumental.
Energy infrastructure is paramount.
And finally, the research strongly suggests we're likely to see a significant geographical shift in where chemicals are produced in the coming decades, likely towards the global south, where demand is growing fastest.
A potential rebalancing of a major global industry.
Wow, okay. From fossil to green chemicals, sustainable pathways, and new carbon feedstock for the global chemical industry, definitely a vital piece of research mapping out this future.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to maybe chew on. Considering this monumental scale of transformation needed for the chemical industry, moving away from fossil fuels, what do you think will be the biggest hurdles? Will they be primarily, technological things we still need to invent, or perfect?
Or maybe economic constraints, like can green chemicals really compete on cost soon enough without massive ongoing subsidies?
Or perhaps the roadblocks are more political and regulatory. Getting global agreement, putting the right policies and incentives in place consistently across the world.
And think about innovation's role. Where can breakthroughs, maybe in catalysis, maybe in recycling tech, maybe in decay efficiency, make the biggest difference in overcoming these hurdles?
It really makes you think about all those everyday products that rely on chemicals, doesn't it? And the profound implications this shift has for the future of manufacturing, for global trade, and ultimately for sustainability. We definitely encourage you to delve deeper into this fascinating and absolutely critical topic.